In January 1991, the peaceful city of Spartanburg, South Carolina, was shattered by a brutal crime that stunned the community. Two young movie theater employees, 19-year-old Alex Hopps and 24-year-old James Todd Green, were murdered in cold blood during what appeared to be a late-night robbery. But this wasn't a crime of desperation. It was a calculated execution carried out by two close friends who turned a simple theft into a double homicide. And while one of them pulled the trigger, the other may have masterminded it all. The gunman? David Rocheville, a quiet, unremarkable young man with no criminal record, who would soon find himself at the center of one of South Carolina's most disturbing murder cases. Under the influence of his charismatic and dangerous accomplice, Richard Longworth, Rocheville's descent into violence was swift, shocking, and deadly. To uncover how a night at the movies became a deadly trap, and how two lives were extinguished in moments of terror, we have to trace the psychological unraveling of a killer. But first, hit subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss a case that reveals the darkest corners of the human mind. David Todd Rocheville was born on June 18, 1968, in South Carolina, where he spent most of his life in the Spartanburg area. He came from a modest, working-class background, and while his early years weren't marked by severe poverty or overt abuse, they were quietly shaped by emotional isolation and a lack of positive male role models. Family and school records indicate that Rocheville was a mostly quiet child, introverted, soft-spoken, and often socially withdrawn. Those who knew him in school described him as polite and respectful but easily led, and emotionally impressionable. He didn't stand out for academic achievement, nor for troublemaking. In fact, by all outward appearances, he was just another ordinary young man navigating adolescence without much direction. By the time he reached his late teens, however, subtle changes in his behavior began to emerge. He became increasingly reclusive and showed signs of psychological withdrawal. Though there were no official diagnoses at the time, later psychiatric evaluations would suggest that David likely struggled with depressive tendencies, low self-worth, and a dependent personality, making him highly susceptible to manipulation and control by dominant figures. This vulnerability would become critical when he developed a close friendship with Richard Longworth, a charismatic and more forceful personality who entered Rocheville's life sometime around 1989. Longworth, who had a history of reckless behavior and an assertive presence, quickly assumed the dominant role in their relationship. According to court testimony and psychological reports, Longworth often took the lead in making decisions, while Rocheville followed along with minimal resistance, eager for approval, acceptance, and belonging. During their friendship, the two began engaging in minor delinquency, vandalism, theft, and trespassing, small steps down a much darker path. Rocheville, despite his meek exterior, seemed to gain a sense of purpose and identity in Longworth's shadow. It was a classic dominant-submissive dynamic. Longworth planned and Rocheville executed, literally. Psychological experts later testified that Rocheville displayed traits of passive-aggressive behavior, emotional detachment, and cognitive dissonance, particularly in how he justified or rationalized his involvement in criminal activities. He was not deemed legally insane, but his mental state revealed a dangerous naivety and a willingness to dissociate from the reality of his actions, especially when pressured by someone he idolized. And by January 1991, that path would lead him, and two innocent victims, straight into tragedy. On the night of January 7, 1991, David Rocheville and Richard Longworth set out with a grim purpose. Armed with a .22 caliber pistol and driven by a plan to commit robbery, they pulled into the parking lot of the Westgate Mall Cinema in Spartanburg, South Carolina, just before closing time. The cinema, located on Blackstock Road, was a familiar spot to both men, quiet, understaffed, and vulnerable late at night. Shortly after arriving, the two entered the theater under the pretense of watching a movie. It was a strategic move, to blend in, observe, and strike when the timing was right. Around 11:30 p.m. as the theater neared closing, they made their move. Their first encounter was with Alex Hopps, a 19-year-old usher who had only recently started working at the cinema. Described by family as kind, gentle, and full of ambition, Alex never saw the danger coming. As he performed his routine end-of-night duties, Longworth reportedly restrained him near a stairwell inside the theater, pinning him in place. Then, without hesitation, Rocheville raised the pistol and shot Hopps once in the head, execution style. He died instantly, crumpled in the quiet darkness of the empty building. With Hopps dead, the pair moved swiftly to find the assistant manager, 24-year-old James Todd Green, who had just finished closing out the night's financials. Under threat of death, they forced Green to open the theater's safe, stealing approximately $2,000 in cash and deposit envelopes. But instead of leaving him behind, they kidnapped Green, forcing him at gunpoint into their minivan, perhaps fearing he could later identify them or alert police. They drove for miles through rural Spartanburg, heading toward the Oak Grove area. Along a secluded roadside near a field, Longworth allegedly ordered Rocheville to take care of it. And once again Rocheville obeyed. Standing behind James Todd Green, who was now kneeling and pleading for his life, Rocheville pulled the trigger, shooting Green in the back of the head and killing him instantly. With both victims dead and the cash in hand, the two fled, returning home in the early morning hours as if nothing had happened. In the aftermath, investigators would uncover a disturbing mix of planning and spontaneity. While the robbery appeared partially premeditated, evidenced by the possession of a weapon, the chosen target, and the time of attack, the murders themselves seem to reflect both cruelty and panic. Some believe Longworth was the driving force, using Rocheville as the trigger man, exploiting his psychological fragility to ensure silence and compliance. Others argue that Rocheville made his own choices, and that by the time he pulled the trigger a second time, he was fully aware of what he was doing. Regardless of intent or influence, the outcome was chillingly clear. 2 innocent lives were lost, brutally extinguished in a matter of minutes, all for a few $1,000s, and a moment of misguided power. The Westgate cinema would never be the same again. Neither would Spartanburg. While the names of killers often dominate headlines, it's the victims whose stories deserve to be remembered, and in the case of Alex Hopps and James Todd Green, their lives were defined by kindness, dedication, and the deep love of their families and communities. Alex Hopps, just 19 years old, was a recent high school graduate working part-time at the Westgate Mall Cinema while pursuing career opportunities. Described by his parents as gentle-hearted and always smiling, Alex was known for his respectful demeanor and his eagerness to help others. He had dreams of going to college and was beloved by coworkers and customers alike. His tragic death cut short a promising future and left a permanent scar on those who knew him. James Todd Green, age 24, was the assistant manager of the theater and a recent newlywed. Hardworking and responsible, James was known for his quiet leadership and compassion. He was saving up to buy a house with his wife and hoped to start a family. According to friends and family interviewed after his death, James was the kind of person who would give you the shirt off his back, always striving to do the right thing even under pressure. The impact of their murders rippled through the Spartanburg community. Candlelight vigils were held outside the theater in the days following the crime, and grief counselors were brought in to help shaken coworkers and students at Alex's former school. In archived interviews, both families expressed heartbreak, not only for the loss of their loved ones but for the unimaginable violence they suffered in their final moments. Less than 24 hours after the brutal murders of Alex Hopps and James Todd Green, law enforcement made a critical breakthrough. On the morning of January 8, 1991, acting on information received during the initial investigation, David Rocheville was arrested at his home in Spartanburg. Confronted with mounting evidence and overwhelming guilt, he quickly confessed to his role in the crimes and made a startling revelation. He led authorities directly to the body of James Green, hidden along a remote stretch of land in the Oak Grove area. His cooperation, however, did little to soften the magnitude of what had occurred. Following his arrest, Rocheville was charged with 2 counts of murder, kidnapping, and armed robbery. His accomplice, Richard Longworth, was arrested shortly after and faced the same charges. The state elected to try both men separately in order to avoid conflicts in testimony and defense strategies. During Rocheville's trial in 1992, his defense team argued that he acted under duress and coercion, painting Longworth as the dominant influence in their partnership, a manipulative figure who planned the robbery and pressured Rocheville into committing the killings. They described Rocheville as emotionally dependent, psychologically fragile, and terrified of losing Longworth's approval. But the prosecution countered with a starkly different narrative. They argued that Rocheville was not only a willing participant, but the actual triggerman in both murders. Evidence showed that he fired the shots that killed both Hopps and Green, and despite claims of coercion, he had multiple opportunities to disengage or seek help, and chose not to. Prosecutors emphasized that both men acted with full knowledge and intent, and that the crimes were calculated, brutal, and unforgivable. After a 2-week trial, the jury convicted David Rocheville on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for the murder of Alex Hopps, due in part to questions about premeditation in that killing, but received the death penalty for the murder of James Todd Green, which had involved kidnapping and execution-style killing. In a separate trial, Richard Longworth was also found guilty and sentenced to death, with the court ruling that he was equally responsible for the planning and execution of the crimes. His sentencing reflected the court's rejection of the idea that he was solely to blame and affirmed that both men had fully participated in the deadly events of that night. The trials brought temporary closure to the victims' families, but they also marked the beginning of a long legal battle, as appeals and motions would stretch on for years. Still, justice, in the eyes of the court, had been served. The lives of two innocent men had been taken, and those responsible would now pay the ultimate price. Following his conviction and death sentence in 1992, David Rocheville's legal team immediately began the appeals process, arguing that his trial was flawed due to insufficient consideration of his psychological vulnerabilities and the alleged coercion he faced from co-defendant Richard Longworth. His case was reviewed by the South Carolina Supreme Court, and in 1993, the court issued a decision in State v. Rocheville, affirming both his conviction and sentence. The justices found no legal error in the trial proceedings and ruled that the death penalty was appropriate, particularly for the premeditated execution-style killing of James Todd Green following a kidnapping, an aggravating factor under South Carolina law. As part of the appeal process, Rocheville underwent further psychological evaluations, which echoed earlier assessments. He was not insane or mentally incompetent, but did exhibit traits of dependent personality disorder and emotional immaturity. However, the courts ultimately determined that these traits did not absolve him of criminal responsibility or reduce his culpability for the murders. During his time on death row at Broad River Correctional Institution in Columbia, South Carolina, Rocheville was described by prison staff as a model inmate. He kept mostly to himself, spent hours reading, and maintained a quiet demeanor. Unlike many on death row, Rocheville did not seek attention, make public statements, or fight extensively to delay his execution beyond the required appellate process. According to correctional records and testimony from a prison chaplain, Rocheville showed increasing signs of remorse in his final years. He reportedly wrote letters of apology to the victims' families, although not all of them were shared publicly, and he often expressed spiritual reflection and guilt over his actions during private counseling sessions. He maintained limited contact with the outside world, communicating with a few relatives and occasionally speaking with prison ministry volunteers. There were no reported disciplinary infractions during his incarceration, and many described his final years as marked by quiet resignation rather than defiance or legal activism. As his appeals were exhausted and no stay of execution was granted, the state of South Carolina scheduled his execution for December 3, 1999. Rocheville did not request clemency and made no final attempt to contest his fate. By that point, nearly 9 years had passed since the night two young men were senselessly murdered, and the time for final judgment had arrived. On December 3, 1999, David Rocheville faced his execution at Broad River Correctional Institution with a somber and composed demeanor, as both the families of the victims and state witnesses observed from behind the glass. Earlier that day, he requested a final meal consisting of steak, French fries, and a soda, according to records from the South Carolina Department of Corrections. As he lay strapped to the gurney, Rocheville used his final words to express remorse, stating, "I want the victims' families to know that I am sorry for what I've done. I take full responsibility. I hope that someday you'll find peace." Shortly after, at approximately 6:15 p.m., the lethal injection was administered, marking the official time of death and closing the final chapter in a case that had haunted South Carolina for nearly a decade. In the wake of David Rocheville and Richard Longworth's brutal crimes, the irreversible cost of just a few minutes of violence left a permanent scar on the lives of the victims' families, who continue to carry the weight of their loss. The case raised painful questions that still echo decades later. Could it have been prevented, and what truly drives a person to commit such senseless acts? Longworth was executed in 2005, closing the legal chapter, but the emotional and psychological wounds remain open in Spartanburg, where this double homicide is still remembered as one of the city's darkest days. What do you think drove David Rocheville to kill? Was he a victim of influence, or fully responsible for his actions? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories that uncover the darkest corners of the human mind.